Welcome to another episode of Divorce Tips. Today, we are talking about how or if I can keep my inheritance from my parents or your aunt safe from my divorce. And I want you guys, if this is particularly affecting you, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Because the short answer is yes, absolutely you can protect those monies as your monies. However, you have to ensure that you keep the protection that each state has set up to ensure that you are protected in a divorce. Because these inherited monies can quickly be commingled with marital monies, which then the court can find marital. So you need to know that if you are getting inheritance money from your parents or your auntie or whatever, you need to know right now, okay, if I get a divorce, whether it's today or in 5 years, how do I protect that money from being able to go into the split of the divorce? You really should answer that question. I know a lot of you get the inheritance, you're like so excited, and your spouse, you're not thinking about divorce. But I'm telling you, you can't predict that every marriage is going to be successful, and you can't predict that every marriage is going to fail in divorce. So what you can do is just protect the monies. It doesn't mean you need to hide them. You need to, necessarily keep them away from your spouse, but you got to protect the monies. So let's talk about how you can do that. The first thing you can do is make sure all those monies go in their own bank account that is in your name only. Okay? And again, you can talk to your spouse about, hey, this is what we want to do with this money. What are you thinking? But you want that money to never be commingled with your marital funds. That is the first way that you're going to lose the protection of separate property. And therefore, if you end up getting, in the statistic of getting divorced, you will not be protected from half those monies going to your spouse. So by ensuring that you make sure that they stay separate, one of the best things and the advice I give on my clients is get a trust. Set up a trust with an attorney. I know you got to spend a little bit of money, but they're not very much. Get a trust that the inheritance monies goes in the trust. This is an even added level of protection because you then have a trustee that is set up with the trust that is the protector of the disbursement of those funds. And therefore, if you can even have in the trust that on divorce that these trustee funds are therefore yours, and you can make sure in that agreement that the trustee is the one who releases the funds to you, and you can then decide if you're going to use those funds for in the marriage, but those funds are protected by trust. Not to mention the trust can protect you from tax implications, which if your parents have tons of money, I would hope that they're talking to an estate planner and that they're putting their money in a trust for purposes of protecting it from taxes. But that's a whole nother episode that we can talk about on another day. So that's the best thing you can do. But I understand that then you're like, well, we were planning on using $50,000 to remodel the house. That's a great use of that money, and I can understand how that's exciting and that's something that you want to do. I just want to caution you to let you know that once you put it into a marital asset, it grays the ability to protect it. So there are some things you can continue to protect it even if you're putting it into a marital, and that is by signing a post-nuptial agreement. Having your spouse claim that the $50,000 you put for the remodel of the house is from your inherited monies, and if you ever get divorced, those inherited monies get paid back before you guys split the remainder of the marital asset. You could do that by protecting the asset. And so by getting that, then you can go and, okay, you get divorced. Now you split 50% of the house, but that $50,000 is going to be paid back first to your inheritance, and then you're going to split the rest on a marital balance. You want to just make sure that when you are looking at the situation that once you pull money and you put it into this marital asset, it's going to be really, really hard for the court to pull back and say, oh, okay, yeah, that's separate property. when it's commingled, especially when it's an appreciating asset. An appreciating asset is like a house or a retirement. So say you take 30,000 of that money from your inheritance and you put it in your IRA stock that you and your spouse have already funded 50,000 of that. It's going to be really, really hard for the court to go in and say, 30,000 of that plus the appreciation, and they're able to separate that and then protect it. Again, separate property is also a very defined specific statute or law for every state. So this is something that you're going to want to get really familiar with your state to ensure that you protect that. With very, very large inheritances as well, one of the things you want to make sure is that if, say, it's in a trust, and I've had this issue happen before, you have to pay the taxes on the appreciation of that money. So a lot of times, depending on the trust, they'll think, we'll just pay those taxes from our marital estate. Well, that causes a little bit of a problem because that spouse can now come and say, listen, we made marital money. We paid marital monies to pay the taxes on that estate. So she or he do not have to pay taxes in the long run. And because of that, it didn't depreciate the asset and therefore it only helped it. And that's been an argument that's been won in court, that therefore it now becomes marital because you've used marital assets to grow it. So you want to kind of look at that. You want to be really, really careful. If you have a trust and you're having to pay taxes on the trust, get the agreement that the trust pays those taxes, that the dispensation of costs come from the actual trust. That, again, keeps it solely separate. And that makes it so that you don't have to share it with your spouse after divorce. Another thing we get is, my parents deeded us a house. We see this a lot, and the parents in good faith decide to deed it to, you and your spouse. And you're like, yay, we get a house, paid off. Well, unfortunately, if they deed that house to you, there is a probability that the court could find that it's marital property, even though your parents are the ones who paid 100% of that house. So you probably don't want to do that. Parents should know better. And honestly, I know that people are like, we're married, we're happy. Unfortunately, I see the worst in when happiness can change, and a few years later, that deeded house becomes a marital asset. And you're like, what did I just do? He's now getting half of my parents' inheritance. You just don't want to do that. So if your parents come to you and say, hey, we're going to deed you the house before we die for tax purposes or blah, 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 say, great, you get to deed me the house because I want to make sure it's protected if for some reason my spouse leaves me or we decide to divorce. And I know that that's a hard conversation to have, but it will only protect you. And guess what? As long as you're married to your spouse, it doesn't matter because they're benefiting from the asset anyways. And at the end of the day, your kids are probably going to get the asset when you die. So this only matters if you're in divorce. So stop looking at us like, how do I have this conversation with my spouse? Look at it as, no, this is great because as long as we don't divorce, which I'm not planning on doing, then it's just that only level of protection. So that's another tip for you, talking about keeping your separate property and inheritance separate for protection. So tune in next week. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed, please subscribe, follow, and share. I'd love to hear your questions and feedback. You can contact me at community@jillcoil.com. See you next time. I am an attorney, but I am not your attorney. Any advice given on the podcast is general and shall not be construed as legal advice.